In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender and bringing World War II to an end. However, the terrifying shadow of nuclear weapons was only just beginning. After the war, the world was divided into 2 opposing camps led by the United States and the Soviet Union. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, during which both sides engaged in an all-out arms race, with nuclear weapons at the center of their competition. In an effort to surpass the Soviet Union in the nuclear arms race, the United States decided to accelerate the development and testing of the hydrogen bomb. However, due to the immense explosive power and radioactive contamination of hydrogen bombs, the U.S. was reluctant to conduct tests on its own soil. Instead, it turned its attention to the Marshall Islands, thousands of miles away. The Marshall Islands are located in the central South Pacific and consist of 29 atolls and 5 small islands. During World War I, Japan occupied the islands, but in 1944, Japanese forces were driven out, and the islands were placed under the administration of the U.S. Navy. Among them, Bikini Atoll, situated in the northwest, was the flattest and most open, making it the ideal site for U.S. nuclear testing. In 1946, the first group of U.S. Army engineers arrived on Bikini Atoll, marking the beginning of the island's tragic fate. At the time, U.S. naval representatives told the indigenous residents that they were carrying out a project to turn weapons of mass destruction into a force for the benefit of all mankind. However, to minimize casualties and avoid domestic and international criticism, the U.S. military relocated the island's inhabitants 240 kilometers away. Yet, they never informed the residents of the true reason for their relocation. Unaware of the nuclear tests and their catastrophic consequences, these indigenous people had no idea of the horrors that would haunt them and their descendants for generations to come. In July 1946, the U.S. military launched Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, conducting 2 successful nuclear detonations. These tests were designed to assess the destructive power of nuclear weapons on warships and their lethal effects on living organisms aboard. To demonstrate its global dominance and intimidate the Soviet Union, the United States made this its first publicly announced nuclear test. As a result, the once obscure Bikini Atoll suddenly became the focus of worldwide attention. A few weeks later, a French designer seized the opportunity to capitalize on the publicity by introducing a new 2-piece swimsuit, naming it the Bikini. This daring fashion statement caused a sensation in the fashion world. From that moment on, bikini became synonymous with sexy swimwear, while few remembered the nuclear tests of that same year, and even fewer recalled the fate of the displaced Bikini Islanders. In 1953, the Soviet Union successfully announced the testing of a practical hydrogen bomb, putting immense pressure on the United States. In response to this challenge, the U.S. decided to detonate an even more powerful hydrogen bomb, Castle Bravo. On March 1, 1954, this hydrogen bomb, originally estimated to have a yield of 6 megatons of TNT, was detonated at Bikini Atoll. However, the actual explosion far exceeded expectations. The blast instantly obliterated 3 islands within the atoll, leaving behind a massive crater 2 kilometers in diameter and 80 meters deep. These islands, which had taken millions of years to form, were either completely altered or annihilated within minutes. Millions of tons of sand, coral, vegetation, and marine life were catapulted several kilometers into the sky. The resulting fireball reached a diameter of 5 miles, while the mushroom cloud spread over a 100-kilometer radius in the South Pacific. Radioactive fallout drifted as far as Australia and Japan. Subsequent calculations by the U.S. military revealed that the hydrogen bomb's actual yield was 15 megatons, 3 times the originally planned size, and more than 1,000 times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Since the U.S. had not anticipated such a catastrophic miscalculation, it had failed to warn fishing vessels operating in the area or the indigenous residents living nearby. At the time, the Japanese fishing boat Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5, was sailing in international waters, 160 kilometers from the blast site. Suddenly, the crew saw a massive fireball rising in the distance, its brightness surpassing that of the sun within seconds. Soon after, nuclear snow began to fall from the sky. All 23 crew members aboard the Lucky Dragon No. 5 were exposed to severe radiation and were later taken to Tokyo for treatment. 6 months later, Aikichi Kuboyama, the ship's chief radio operator and the oldest member of the crew, succumbed to radiation sickness. He was only 40 years old. According to statistics, between March and mid-May 1954, in just 2.5 months, over 300 fishing boats caught hundreds of tons of tuna contaminated by radiation. From then on, people no longer dared to fish in this region, dealing a devastating blow to Japan's deep-sea fishing industry. However, compared to the Japanese fishermen, the fate of the local islanders was even more tragic. After the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb explosion, nuclear snow spread across the entire Marshall Islands, with some areas accumulating up to 2 centimeters of radioactive fallout. The children on the islands had no understanding of its dangers. They picked up the white flakes with their hands, played with them, and even put them in their mouths, believing them to be real snow. Meanwhile, some early rising women who were washing themselves in the lagoon mistook the white dust falling from the sky for soap powder and used it to clean their hair. Everything seemed normal, except for the monstrous mushroom cloud towering in the distance and the eerie snow-like fallout drifting down from the sky. But within days, islanders began to suffer from severe radiation sickness. Symptoms included vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss, and skin burns. However, the response from the United States was appalling. Despite knowing that the levels and spread of radiation had far exceeded expectations, the U.S. took no action to evacuate the nearby residents, allowing the disaster to unfold unchecked. Even more horrifying, the U.S. military saw a valuable research opportunity in this tragedy. Following the detonation of this unexpectedly powerful hydrogen bomb, the U.S. quickly launched a new research program, the biomedical effects of Castle Bravo, also known as Project 4. One of its key studies, Project 4.1, focused on the effects of high-yield nuclear weapons on human exposure to intense beta and gamma radiation. 6 days later, a U.S. medical team arrived on the island, clad in full protective gear. But they were not there to provide medical assistance. Instead, the islanders became human test subjects. The victims were placed inside a sealed chamber filled with radiation detection instruments, where they underwent a series of medical examinations and tests. Some were even taken to the United States for further study. Once the U.S. had collected enough research data, the islanders were given a small amount of food, but received no real humanitarian aid. In 1955, the United States conducted a follow-up study on 241 fishermen who had been exposed to radiation. That same year, 12 of them died from liver cirrhosis and cancer. Within a year, 61 more succumbed to leukemia, cancer, and liver cirrhosis. However, these alarming statistics did not prompt the U.S. to halt or even slow down its nuclear testing. It was only in 1958, under mounting global pressure, that the U.S. was finally forced to cease nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. Between 1946 and 1958, over a span of 12 years, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, 23 of which took place at Bikini Atoll alone. In terms of TNT equivalent, these tests meant that for every single day during those 12 years, a nuclear explosion more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb occurred. Although the U.S. ended its nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, the devastating effects of the explosions did not disappear. By the time the U.S. officially halted nuclear tests, the contaminated area had reached 11,000 square kilometers. Radioactive particles had even spread as far as the Indian Ocean, impacting the global environment. Beyond the environmental contamination, the nuclear tests also led to severe ecological destruction. 42 species of marine life in Bikini Atoll and surrounding waters disappeared, 28 of which became permanently extinct. The number of affected tuna and other marine species was beyond estimation. In 1978, scientists discovered that the radiation levels in Bikini Atoll residents were alarmingly high. Every single Bikini Islander had absorbed more radiation than an average American would in 30 years, they reported. The levels of cesium-137 alone exceeded the human body's tolerance by 11 times, and it would take nearly a century for cesium-137 on Bikini Atoll to decay to a safe level. Today, Bikini Atoll is uninhabitable. Radiation has contaminated the water and food supply. Almost all of the islanders suffer from leukemia, thyroid cancer, and other radiation-induced diseases. Our women either miscarry or give birth to deformed monsters. We all have leukemia and thyroid cancer, one local woman once said, describing the ongoing tragedy. When the Marshallese sought to leave this cursed land, the United States, which prides itself on democracy and human rights, turned a blind eye to their suffering and refused their request. In the end, it was only with the help of the non-governmental organization Greenpeace that the Bikini Islanders were finally relocated to a safer island. Between 1977 and 1980, the U.S. military sent troops to Enewetak Atoll to clean up the nuclear testing site. The radioactive soil and other contaminated waste were dumped into a deep crater on Runit Island, which had been created by a nuclear explosion. The site was then sealed with concrete. However, in recent years, due to unusual seismic activity and rising sea levels, cracks and fissures have begun to form in the dome, posing a serious risk of radioactive leakage into the ocean and nearby lagoons, a potential catastrophe for the global environment. As victims of nuclear contamination, the Marshall Islands filed a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice after gaining independence, demanding a formal apology and substantial financial compensation from the U.S. government. However, under heavy pressure from the United States, the ICJ delayed its ruling until 1988. Eventually, the court ordered the U.S. to pay $2.3 billion in compensation and take responsibility for maintaining the nuclear waste containment dome. Yet, the U.S. Congress and government outright refused to comply, claiming they had no obligation to repair the dome. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster struck, releasing massive amounts of radiation. The U.S.-led Western Bloc launched an aggressive propaganda campaign, painting the Soviet Union as an authoritarian regime that disregarded human life. Even today, Chernobyl remains synonymous with nuclear catastrophe, serving as a grim reminder to the world. Yet, when faced with its own nuclear legacy, the United States shamelessly evades responsibility. Is that not the ultimate irony? While some mourn the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who still remembers the tragic fate of an entire people buried beneath the image of a sexy swimsuit?